Simon finally got up from his seat and walked to the stage to the whispers of students who did not understand who he was and why he was the #1 student. They all looked at each other. He stood next to Surnine Dark, sweating with excitement. But then he decided to pull himself together, to stop being nervous and just read what he was told. Together with Cern, they raised their hands and began to recite the oath. After they said the oath, he went back to his seat and began to think. It was true when he was told that Kizen was a very intense school, he could never have imagined that they would keep the whole class together all day for the initiation ceremony. There were 14 groups with more than 1,000 new students and every group was full. After everyone found out that he was #1 among the freshmen, everyone started whispering about him. No one had ever heard of him before, and no one had ever heard of his family with the last name Valencia either. Simon was very tense because of this. Simon started his first day of school very stressed, he was on pins and needles about how many lessons he had to have. It was a good thing he had written down his schedule in his notebook. Looking through it, he settled on summonology, which was the class he wanted to take the most. Because it was the type of magic his father had used. This meant that he would be able to be like his father if he took this course. But Simon's first lesson was on catarology, and it began with the students rattling their pens and writing down the teacher's introduction. The professor paced from side to side and said that some people associate necromancers with dark and gloomy images of handling corpses in the dark. But all this is in the past, modern necromancers are smart, practical, with a sense of style and trends. This is the new generation of necromancers, and this is how Bahil Amagar, a professor of catarology, started his career. He was a young star necromancer, a member of the Crow's Kizen's core battling group in his late 20s, and an idol of unrivaled popularity among Kizen students. He greeted everyone and explained that he would be teaching them catarology this year. The students were delighted and began to applaud him, he was a legend to them. Professor Bahil decided to start his class by checking attendance, and since they were probably seeing each other for the first time, he asked everyone to briefly introduce themselves when he called their name. And he called the first name Jamie Victoria, and a girl with green hair and glasses jumped out from behind the first desk raising her hand. She shouted that she was present and it was a great honor for her to meet him, she was going to become a specialist in catarology, following in the footsteps of the professor. But the professor stopped her with a wave of his hand, he advised her to introduce herself to her classmates, not to him, so let her try again. Jamie Victoria tried again, this time introducing herself to the students. Eventually it was to Simon's turn, but as soon as he said his name and where he was from, everyone started whispering about him again. After him, another guy named Hector Moore introduced himself. When everyone had finished introducing themselves, the professor noticed that they were all full of charm, but they should start their lesson. He began to draw a fundamental question on the board with chalk. Why should they study catarology? And he broke the chalk on the board. He asked all the students in the classroom if any of them could say the definition of catarology as a subject, and Jamie Victoria immediately jumped up from her seat with her hand raised. She said quickly and memorized that it is a type of dark magic that retains its power by weakening the enemy. The professor praised her answer. But he noted that some of the students would not quite understand what he was talking about, so he would rather just say that catarology is about weakening the opponent. Then he started drawing them an example on the board. And then he continued, let's say that there are two knights with approximately the same skill level, they start to fight vigorously with swords. They try to tire each other out and wait for the opponent to make a mistake, they exchange about 20 blows, but neither of them gives up. Simon listens to the story with fascination. However, one knight starts shouting loudly at the other and looking at him with a murderous look. His opponent is frightened, trembling and turning pale with fear. Finally, the knight's sword cuts the opponent's shoulder. He begins to bleed and his movements slow down and shake. The other knight realizes that this is his chance to win. He corners the enemy and attacks his leg to make him unable to move. Then he throws sand in his eyes and hits him on the head to distract him and keep him off balance. The battle is getting tense and finally, the knight finally cuts off his opponent's head, which falls to the ground. The professor has put the final point in his scheme. He asked the students whether they now see that even the most primitive and barbaric battles with cold steel are simply a series of actions that weaken the opponent in order to gradually achieve victory. The students were delighted with how the professor was able to explain a complex term in an interesting way. Now he was going to show them how modern necromancers fight. Professor Bahil began to draw on the board again, he depicted a conventional person, and then voiced his rhetorical question, how a modern necromancer would defeat this person. And he began to move the chalk quickly across the board. Then he hit the chalk against the board, death by curse after the first movement. And the necromancer won. The students were delighted, but did not quite understand what had happened. The professor began to explain that a curse is the lightest and simplest structure among all types of dark magic, and its other characteristic is that it is quickly activated. Moreover, it is effective as a low effort, allowing you to completely shake and confuse your opponent. The professor took a few steps and came close to the boy's desk with a smile. He continued to look at him smiling for several seconds. The boy did not understand what was happening and smiled nervously back. At the same time, unbeknownst to him, the professor was cursing him. And in a moment, this student fell helplessly on his desk with a dull thud. The professor took the knife and made a pretense of swinging. He said that this is how modern necromancers fight, and he pulled the knife towards the student and then put it away. All the students were delighted with the performance, except for that student. They shouted that it was so cool and that catarology was the best. The professor lifted his curse on that poor student with one snap of his fingers and continued his speech that he didn't want to know what subject they would choose to specialize in, but he dared to guess that more than 80% of them would choose his subject for the second semester. Simon was also excited about this class. He believed that catarology had the best compatibility with other subjects. The professor concluded his class by urging them to practice their specializations, but not to forget to curse their opponents whenever they have the opportunity. This will be the most effective way to win. He personally believes that catarology is the core of modern necromancy. The reason for this was that, having stopped, the teacher turned around and looked at the class, which was listening attentively to him and taking notes. Then with a sharp movement he revealed to the whole class the inscription he had written. Priests. This inscription was on the board, and that is why catarology was the most effective way of confronting their main enemies. With a serious voice explained the teacher, looking carefully at the class. Then turning to the students, some of whom looked at him with confusion, he asked them if necromancers had curses and priests had blessings. The difference was that one strengthened the target while the other weakened it. The question was to see when a curse was better than a blessing. The green-haired girl with glasses, who had been introduced earlier, jumped up from her seat, raising her hand in the air and calling her name again. Then she answered the question posed earlier by the professor, explaining that curses were quicker than blessings. Which meant that curses could accumulate a weakening effect on the target faster, which was a huge advantage in real combat. Hearing the girl's answer, the teacher rubbed his chin thoughtfully, saying that it was an interesting opinion. But then added that it was wrong. The girl who answered froze in place with a raised hand and a bewildered look on her face. Seeing that no one else was willing to answer, the teacher began his explanations. Beginning with the fact that if you consider only the speed of application, the scientists come to a consensus that the curses that are imposed through the resistance of the enemy, a little slower than the blessing of the priest. After finishing his explanation, the teacher asked if anyone had anything to add, and immediately a hand went up. The guy who raised his hand introduced himself as Hector Moore. Turning to the instructor, he replied that there was almost no one who trained in a weakened state. Intrigued by the boy's answer, the instructor looked at him with interest and then asked him to state his name again. After the yellow-haired boy repeated his name, the professor said that he would remember it, to which he sat down in his seat to the applause of the class. The professor continued the lecture, explaining that Hector's words were correct, because weakening spells really can't be blocked by training. Then the professor continued, saying that everyone when practicing is conditioned while in a normal state. And the measure of skills depends on how much and how well a person will train. It is also important to take into account all environmental factors and whether they are under our control. Raising his index finger up, the instructor emphasized that humans were more sensitive creatures than they appeared and could break even at the slightest change. In other words, you didn't need to take your entire arm away from an archer who was targeting you for victory. You just had to load his vision with conjunctivitis, make him nauseous and vomit, confuse his sense of distance and blur his vision, or simply divert his attention to another object while he escaped. With such simple and uncomplicated solutions, you could avoid the arrow flying at you, the teacher summarized. Then turning to the blackboard where the diagram was drawn, he said that necromancers have many ways to disrupt the state of the enemy. He then gave an example, saying that no one would practice to prepare for curses when they had a stomach ache or were tired. The instructor continued by saying that they could just take the day off. Hearing his words, the class chuckled. After waiting for the class to calm down, the teacher said that they should remember one important thing. And that was that they should think how to weaken others instead of thinking how to strengthen themselves, because the best defense is offense. The door opened. And 3 female assistants entered the classroom carrying boxes with the academy's emblem on them. After everyone had a set of what they would need for training, the teacher announced in a solemn voice that they would now have to learn how to cast curses on others. Simon, as you can see, was easily dumbfounded. Because he couldn't believe they were learning dark magic in their first class. The teacher reminded the class that it should be a shame if a Kizen student used a proofreader, but made an allowance since it was the first class and also the first lesson. For Simon it was a shot in the eye, not in the eyebrow, because he was the one who used the corrector. The reason why the teacher didn't want the students to use it was because it was quite useful in mastering, but there was a risk of becoming addicted to it, so one had to be careful. Finished with the theory, the teacher clapped his hands and then turned to the class saying that now it was time to practice the curse of exhaustion. He then began to explain that the students had to hold on to the handles of the corrective device and squeeze their darkness into the pattern shape of the corrective device. He further explained that the key to successfully forming the perfect magic circle was the rune word, which was a set of letters possessing magical power. After that, the teacher raised his hand on which appeared a dark magical sign, around which there were many magical letters. After showing an example, he explained that writing the words of the rune with darkness causes magic. Seeing that everyone had finished creating magic circles, the teacher told everyone to raise them up. On top of the pattern of the magic circle that was on the device appeared another magic circle consisting of darkness. Simon was delighted to see this, as he had succeeded the first time. However, to Simon's surprise and incomprehension, the class was filled with cheers of students who managed to fulfill the teacher's task. In addition, his magic circle looked much more unreliable than the others and threatened to collapse at any second. Which happened in the next moment. Noticing Simon's failure, the teacher explained that this happens if you don't refine the darkness properly or loosen the binding of the magic circle, and then he ordered the boy to try again, to which he nodded in response. Walking up the steps of the classroom, the instructor said that those who could keep the magic circle in the air would move on to actual practice. He added that everyone had to have a plant that was given with the corrective device. Simon went on to create a stable magic circle. To the students who succeeded, the teacher told them to aim at the plant on the table. Then use the curse on the poor plant that was just beginning to enjoy life. To the students who succeeded, the plant shriveled up and took on a sickly appearance. In the next second the plant dramatically fell on its back with its arms spread out, ending its not long but very useful life, which will serve for the formation of a new generation of necromancers. The teacher explained that if the plant had noticeable changes, it meant that the magic circle was working properly. The golden-haired boy saw that the plant had taken a lying position and did not look healthy at all and exclaimed joyfully. The teacher noted that he was beginning to see the difference in skills between the students. At the same time Simon once again tried to stabilize the magic circle, which despite all his attempts did not become more stable. The teacher did not pay attention to Simon, who failed to create a magic circle, turned to the other students, saying that if they succeeded, they should repeat it to practice the speed of creating a magic circle. Simon failed at creating a circle once again. He clutched the knobs of the corrective device in frustration. He couldn't understand what his problem was. And why he was the only one failing. The other students, having successfully completed the first step, began casting the curse on the plants. Simon could not help but wonder what he was doing wrong. But suddenly a phrase he had heard before popped into his head. When Lorraine and Nephthys looked at the clot of darkness that had formed on his arm, they were amazed to see that it also had the properties of mana, and that it was swirling like a flame, which meant that it was in a vaporous state. Nephthys added that this was why he was entering the academy, to learn how to use his core. Realizing that what Lorraine and Nephthys had said about him being very bad at operating mana was absolutely true. Simon decided to start with the basics in order to move from where he was stuck. Putting the device aside, he set his thoughts aside and concentrated only on the task at hand. Remembering Professor Bahil's words that the problem was either a lack of purification or a binding to the circle, he decided instead of sending the mana directly to the core, he would collect it as much as he needed. Then would send all the collected mana into the core at one time. Now that there was enough mana in the core, and his darkness was much stronger, all Simon had to do. So it was to pour his darkness back into the device and create a magic circle. As expected, it worked now, and the guy managed to form a perfect circle, which he immediately directed at the innocent plant, which had already given up hope that the guy would succeed. Fully prepared, Simon shouted a curse and activated the magic circle. He cast the curse on the plant, which immediately became painful and covered with a dark aura. Then he looked at his abuser one last time with resentment and tears in his eyes. The plant dramatically passed away. Simon couldn't be happy that he had finally succeeded, though not the first time. There was a man in the middle of the class who had been watching Simon closely all this time. Hector had been praised by the teacher and was one of the first to do the task. When he saw Simon's success, he clucked his tongue in annoyance. Clapping his hands to get the students' attention, the teacher said that was all that applied to practice. As for those who failed, they would have to practice after they returned to the dormitories. Hearing the teacher's words, Simon breathed a sigh of relief as he was still able to complete the assignment, even though it was not the first time. However, Professor Bahil continued, saying that now they had to show what they had learned in this lesson. The teacher's words took Simon by surprise. The next moment the teacher noted with surprise that special admission number 1 was in this class. Then calling the name of the main character, he asked him to come forward. The eyes of the whole class were immediately directed at Simon, who, feeling uncomfortable, hesitantly agreed. The students, hearing that he was a special admission student, speculated about how good he would be. Professor Bahil decided that a special admission student needed a worthy opponent, so he decided to choose one from the students who had passed the entrance exam with impressive results. Calling Hector Moore's name, he asked him to step forward. Simon stood in the middle of the class opposite his tall and confident opponent and listened to the rules explained by the teacher. Simon and Hector were given corrective devices, and then Professor Bahil explained that they were only allowed to use the curse of exhaustion. The task was to create a magic circle and use it on the enemy. The first one to fail to stay on their feet. After hearing the rules, Hector raised his hand, saying that he would compete without the corrective device. The professor nodded his head and praised him, saying that such an attitude was welcome. Looking at the boy, who was staring at his opponent with drained confidence, Professor Bahil noted to himself that he seemed quite intelligent for his weak bare form. Remembering his words about using the device being undesirable, he noted that the boy had remembered that and decided to impress him by demonstrating his skills. Turning to Simon, he asked if he was going to use the corrective device, to which he replied in an uncertain voice that he was. With a disdainful look at the protagonist, the professor said yes. The next moment, with a smile on his face, he raised his hand, saying that they could start as soon as he gave the command and also wishing them good luck. There was silence between Simon and Hector. Hector frowned at Simon, while the latter didn't feel very confident against such an experienced and formidable opponent. In the next second, Professor Bahil gave the command to start the contest. Holding the corrective device in his hands and beginning to release the darkness into her, he calmed himself, telling himself not to be nervous and just do it like last time. Assuring himself that if he tried hard enough he could do it. Suddenly, however, previously unknown horrible feeling enveloped him. With a blurry look at his opponent, Simon couldn't believe his eyes. Hector freely steered the circle with one hand and pointed it at Simon. The students were surprised and praised how Hector was able to create a circle so quickly without a device. The boy held the circle in one hand and looked at the hall with a satisfied face. Simon didn't know what to do, as not only was he creating a circle slower than his opponent even with the device, but the mere hitting of his opponent made him feel very tired. Deciding not to wonder, Simon raised the device in front of him and resumed creating the circle. However, just like last time, his circle was very unstable and began to collapse. He decided that such a circle would be useless even if he managed to use it on his opponent, and having destroyed the circle himself, he decided to start from scratch. The next moment he felt tired again and almost collapsed to the ground. Noticing that Simon had not given up and was trying to keep fighting, Hector used the curse on him again. But it didn't end once like last time. This time he continued to use the curse on the protagonist over and over again. The rest of the students looked at this scene with confusion. Stopping at 5 iteration, Hector said that should be enough. Barely able to stay on his feet, Simon could hear the chatter of a student who wondered with disdain if he was really number 1 once unable to start a single spell. Turning to Simon, who was breathing heavily, Hector told him to give up, adding that he was pathetic to look at. Not seeing that the guy was going to give up, Hector asked irritably if he wanted to see how it ended. He used another curse that was noticeably stronger than the previous ones, causing Simon to groan in pain and clench his teeth. As Professor Bahil watched the contest from the sidelines, he pondered the potential of the contestants. Concluding that Hector was a gem that did not lie in the road, besides his talent, he also possessed the mindset of a Kizen student. He would most likely become an outstanding student who could survive to the 3rd grade. On the other hand, a special admission number 1 who had no prior training or basic knowledge of dark magic, let alone any real experience. Professor Bahil couldn't help but wonder why Nephthys had chosen this particular boy. Numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4, who are officially invited into Kizen without passing preliminary exams, are supposed to be talents that are born once every few centuries. Especially number 1, who was always chosen by Nephthys herself and was bound to achieve outstanding results in his field. However, in the guy he was looking at now, he did not at all see the potential that was supposed to be in a person called the most talented. Looking at Simon, who despite his opponent's numerous attacks continued to stand on his feet, Bahil speculated that perhaps his specialty was stamina. Since normal students of his age kneel down after the 4th graduation, but he continued to stay on his feet even after the 9th graduation. Furthermore, he continued to maintain the magic circle while it was incredibly difficult for him to just stay awake, which was a testament to the fact that his spirit was also incredibly strong. But unfortunately that wasn't what was needed to pass the test, as magic combat professors valued physical and mental strength, so his specialty had nothing to do with it. But to his surprise, Simon, despite all the weakening curses placed on him, not only managed to stay on his feet, but also managed to complete the magic circle. After which, he shouted the exhaust spell. He released a weakening curse directly at Hector, who did not expect such a repulse from an opponent who could hardly stand on his feet. Bahil's teacher froze in place with admiration on his face, unable to believe what he had just seen. Simon was also glowing with happiness, even though he was only able to land a single blow. Holding his hand to the floor, Hector couldn't believe what had just happened. Nor could he believe that such an exhaust power could even exist. Not even during the prep session had this happened. Unwilling to accept that he could be attacked at all, he promised himself that he would never miss another spell again, and that he would end this annoying fight right now. Creating a new spell, he furiously shouted an exhaust spell and used it on Simon, who groaned painfully. The next moment, the adjustment device fell to the floor, followed by the defeated Simon, who had no strength to stand. The match was over, and Professor Bahil congratulated Hector on his victory with a smile on his face, but Hector didn't look happy about the victory, even though the whole class was cheering and shouting his name. Then turning to Simon, who was still on his knees, and having removed the effects of the weakening, the teacher also praised him, saying that he had done a great job and was able to show a great match. He then clapped his hands and announced the end of today's class. At the end of the class, one of the students approached Bahil and said that she had some questions about today's lecture. To which he replied that she should come to his office after today's class and he would answer all her questions. Hearing this, the girl glowed with joy and thanked the professor. Bahil, however, told himself that he couldn't lose such a precious moment for the sake of some frivolous girl. Simon Valencia, said Bahil alone standing in the middle of the empty classroom. That last release he was able to make at the end, it was far more valuable than the 9 exhausts Hector performed. That was the best strike, muttered Bahil with a delighted smile.